The security guard barely glanced up from his newspaper as the maintenance woman shuffled past the checkpoint, her worn boots squeaking against the polished linoleum of Fort Braxton's administrative complex. Morning sunlight filtered through. Tall windows casting long shadows across the pristine hallways where the smell of industrial cleaner mingled with coffee brewing in distant break rooms. Her name tag, cracked and yellowed with age, read Martinez Rosa in faded block letters that had seen better days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rosa Martinez moved with the measured pace of someone who had learned to navigate the world invisibly. Her gray jumpsuit hung loose on her small frame, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with the kind of weathered skin that spoke of decades spent outdoors. A canvas tool bag bounced gently against her hip as she walked, filled with spray bottles, rags, and the various implements of custodial work that had become her daily routine for the past 8 years. The administrative wing of Fort Braxton hummed with its usual morning energy. Officers in crisp uniforms strode purposefully down corridors, lined with portraits of distinguished military leaders, their conversations a blend of operational briefings and weekend plans. Civilian contractors clustered around coffee stations, tablets and smartphones in hand, discussing budget reports and maintenance schedules. Through it all, Rosa moved like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable, her presence as familiar and forgettable as the beige paint on the walls. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb emerged from his office, adjusting the brass insignia on his pressed uniform jacket. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the hierarchy. His black hair was cut regulation short, and his pale blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The ribbons on his chest told a story of administrative excellence and peacetime service, each colored bar representing awards earned in conference rooms rather than combat zones. Webb's voice carried down the hallway as he spoke to his aide, Captain Jennifer Stone, about the upcoming inspection. His tone was clipped and professional, the kind of measured authority that came from years of managing budgets and personnel files rather than leading soldiers through hostile territory. As they walked, Rosa stepped aside to let them pass, pressing herself against the wall with the practiced invisibility of the service staff. "Make sure the custodial teams understand," Webb was saying, his voice just loud enough for Rosa to catch fragments of his words. "Everything needs to be spotless. I won't have the general's inspection compromised by lazy cleaning standards." He glanced in Rosa's direction with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for furniture or equipment, present but ultimately insignificant. Captain Stone nodded dutifully, her tablet already open to the inspection checklist. She was younger than Webb, perhaps 35. With brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun and the eager efficiency of an officer still working to prove herself. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed to knife-edge creases, and her shoes gleamed with the kind of polish that required daily attention. "Should I speak with the custodial supervisor about additional staff?" Stone asked, her pen poised over her. "Notes." Webb waved a dismissive hand. "These people know their jobs, or they should. We're not running a charity here." His eyes swept over Rosa again, this time with a slight frown. "Though some of them look like they might need reminding about basic grooming standards." Rosa's grip tightened imperceptibly on her tool bag strap, but her expression remained neutral. She had heard worse over the years, much worse. The casual dismissal in Webb's voice was familiar territory, a landscape she had learned to navigate without showing the wounds it left behind. Her weathered hands, scarred from decades of work both seen and unseen, betrayed nothing of the storm of memories his words stirred. The morning routine continued with its predictable rhythm. Rosa made her way to the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a cramped space that smelled of ammonia and floor wax. She methodically filled her spray bottles, checked her cleaning supplies, and organized her equipment with the precision of someone who understood that efficiency was the key to invisibility. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across shelves lined with industrial-strength chemicals and paper products. From the hallway outside, she could hear the murmur of conversations as the day shift settled into their routines. Administrative assistants discussed quarterly reports over coffee, their voices mixing with the distant hum of copy machines and printers. Occasionally, footsteps would pause outside the supply closet, followed by hushed comments that Rosa had grown accustomed to over the years. "Hard to believe they let someone that old handle the cleaning chemicals," one voice whispered to another. "She looks like she could barely lift a mop bucket." "Probably hired under some diversity program," came the response, followed by muffled laughter that faded as the speakers moved down the hallway. Rosa's movements never faltered as she arranged cleaning supplies in her cart. Her face remained impassive, carved from years of practice into a mask of professional neutrality. But deep in her chest, something stirred, not hurt, exactly, but a familiar ache that had nothing to do with her aging joints and everything to do with the weight of secrets carried for too long. The third floor of the administrative complex housed the personnel offices, records departments, and conference rooms where decisions were made about budgets, assignments, and careers. It was a realm of paperwork and protocol, where battles were fought with spreadsheets and victories measured in efficiency ratings. Rosa had cleaned these offices for years, moving through them with the same methodical precision she brought to every task. Room 312 was Colonel Webb's domain, a corner office with windows overlooking the parade ground. Rosa knocked softly on the doorframe before entering, her cart wheels rolling quietly across the threshold. Webb looked up from his computer screen with mild irritation, as if her presence was an unwelcome interruption to more important matters. "Try not to disturb anything on my desk," he said curtly, not bothering to look at her directly. "I have important documents that need to stay organized." Rosa nodded silently and began her work, starting with the trash bins and working her way methodically around the office. She had developed a system over the years that allowed her to clean efficiently while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. The key was to become part of the background, to blend into the environment so completely that her presence became forgettable. As she worked, Webb continued his phone conversation with someone about budget allocations for the upcoming fiscal year. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions matter, discussing millions of dollars in funding as casually as others might talk about lunch plans. Rosa moved around him carefully, dusting shelves lined with military manuals and leadership books, her cloth moving in practice strokes that left no trace of her passage. "The problem with these support staff positions," Webb was saying into his phone, apparently unaware that Rosa could hear every word, "is that we end up with people who have no real understanding of military standards. Half of them look like they wandered off the street." Rosa's hand paused for just a moment on the spine of a book about military history, her fingers tracing the embossed letters of a title she knew by heart. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, but something flickered behind her dark eyes, a shadow of memory that belonged to a different time, a different version of herself that existed only in classified files and the nightmares of men who had learned to trust her with their lives. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of small humiliations and casual dismissals. In the break room, Rosa refilled paper towel dispensers while a group of civilian contractors discussed weekend plans, their conversation flowing around her as if she were invisible. One of them, a young man in his 20s with an expensive watch and the soft features of someone who had never missed a meal, gestured broadly as he told a story about his latest hunting trip. "You should have seen this deer," he was saying, his voice full of the kind of excitement that came from recreational adventure rather than survival necessity. "Must have been a 12-pointer. Had him in my sights for a full minute before I took the shot." His companions murmured appreciatively, their attention focused on his tale of weekend heroics. Rosa continued her work, methodically wiping down surfaces and emptying trash bins, her presence as unremarkable as the furniture. But as the young man described the moment of the kill, something shifted almost imperceptibly in her posture, a straightening of her shoulders, a slight tension in her jaw that spoke of memories where the stakes had been considerably higher than recreational bragging rights. "Clean shot, right through the heart," the young man continued, pride evident in his voice. "My grandfather always said the key to hunting is patience and precision. Wait for the right moment, then execute perfectly." Rosa's cleaning cloth moved in steady circles across the stainless steel surface of the coffee station, but her eyes had grown distant, focused on something beyond the break room walls. In her mind, other voices echoed, urgent whispers in the darkness, coordinates called out over radio static, the weight of a rifle that meant the difference between life and death, for people whose names would never appear in hunting magazines. Conversation shifted to other topics: sports scores, television shows, complaints about traffic, the mundane concerns of people whose greatest challenges involved commute times and restaurant reservations. Rosa finished her work and moved on, her cartwheels squeaking softly as she navigated the hallways toward her next assignment. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's secretary, Staff Sergeant Patricia Coleman, was a career administrator in her late 30s, who took pride in maintaining the perfect efficiency of the office operations. Her desk was organized with military precision, every pen in its proper place, every file folder labeled and color-coded according to priority. She had worked for Webb for 3 years and had developed a keen understanding of his preferences and prejudices. "The cleaning woman is in the colonel's office," Coleman mentioned to Captain Stone as they reviewed the day's schedule. "I hope she doesn't take too long. We have the budget meeting in an hour, and the colonel gets agitated when his routine is disrupted." Stone glanced toward Webb's office, where Rosa could be seen through the glass partition, methodically dusting the bookshelves. "How long has she been working here?" Stone asked, more out of idle curiosity than genuine interest. 8 years, I think," Coleman replied, consulting her personnel roster. "Maybe longer. They all tend to blend together after a while. Reliable enough, I suppose, though I sometimes wonder if the security clearance process for support staff is as thorough as it should be." Through the glass they could see Rosa moving with practiced efficiency, her gray jumpsuit and bent posture making her appear older and more frail than her actual 62 years. To the women watching from outside, she represented nothing more than part of the institutional machinery that kept the administrative complex functioning, necessary but unremarkable. Like the HVAC system or the fluorescent lighting, what they couldn't see were the scars that mapped Rosa's forearms beneath her rolled sleeves, faded white lines that told stories of shrapnel and barbed wire, of midnight extractions and dawn raids where the difference between success and catastrophic failure was measured in heartbeats. They couldn't see the steady hands that had never trembled when lives hung in the balance, the same hands that now gripped a cleaning cloth with the muscle memory of someone who had once held much deadlier tools with equal precision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning inspection of the building's security protocols brought a parade of officials through the corridors. Their conversations focused on access controls, surveillance systems, and threat assessments. Rosa continued her work, invisible to the various experts who discussed the complex's vulnerabilities and defensive measures. Their words washed over her like background noise, but occasionally a phrase would catch her attention, something about perimeter security or personnel screening that would cause her to pause. Almost imperceptibly, in her cleaning routine, Major Sandra Richardson, the base security officer, was conducting a walkthrough with Webb and several other officials, their voices carrying down the hallway as they discussed recent updates to security protocols. Richardson was a compact woman in her 40s with short red hair and the alert posture of someone who had spent years analyzing threats and vulnerabilities. Her uniform bore the badges of specialized training in counterintelligence and force protection. The challenge with a facility like this, Richardson was explaining to the group, is balancing accessibility with security. We have hundreds of personnel moving through these corridors daily, plus contractors, visitors, and support staff. Each category presents its own risk profile. Webb nodded thoughtfully, his hands clasped behind his back in what he probably thought was a commanding pose. "What about background checks for the custodial staff?" he asked. "Some of these people have been here for years. Standards might have been different when they were hired." Rosa's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly as she continued cleaning a water fountain near the group, her movements steady despite the conversation happening just feet away. Major Richardson consulted her tablet, scrolling through personnel files with professional efficiency. "Most of the long-term custodial staff have been thoroughly vetted," Richardson replied. "Though you're right that standards have evolved. The woman over there, for instance," she gestured toward Rosa without really looking at her, "has been here 8 years. Her file shows standard background screening, but nothing particularly detailed." The group moved on, their discussion shifting to other security concerns, but Webb's gaze lingered on Rosa for a moment longer than necessary. There was something in his expression, not suspicion exactly, but the kind of casual dismissal that came from years of viewing support staff as essentially interchangeable. To him, Rosa was simply part of the landscape, no more worthy of individual attention than the fire extinguishers or exit signs. As the morning progressed toward noon, administrative complex settled into its predictable rhythm of meetings, phone calls, and bureaucratic efficiency. Rosa worked her way through her assigned areas with the methodical precision that had become second nature over the years. Each task was completed to exact standards, every surface left spotless, every trash bin emptied and relined with fresh bags. In the women's restroom on the second floor, Rosa encountered 2 young civilian employees discussing their weekend plans. They were in their 20s, recent college graduates who had landed entry-level positions in the base's Human Resources Department. Their conversation was filled with the casual confidence of people who had never questioned their place in the world. "I still can't believe they make us share facilities with the cleaning staff," one of them was saying as she applied lipstick in the mirror. "It's kind of gross, don't you think? I mean, who knows where these people have been?" Her companion, a blonde woman with expensive highlights and manicured nails, nodded in agreement. "My dad always said you can tell everything you need to know about a place by how they treat their service workers. This base obviously doesn't have very high standards." Rosa emerged from one of the stalls, moving toward the sinks with the same quiet dignity she brought to all her interactions. The 2 women fell silent, suddenly aware of her presence, their faces flushing with the embarrassment of people who had been caught speaking carelessly. But Rosa's expression remained neutral as she washed her hands, dried them with a paper towel, and left without acknowledging their comments. Outside in the hallway, Rosa paused for just a moment, her hand resting on her cleaning cart's handle. For the briefest instant, her composed mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath, the ghost of a woman who had once commanded respect through actions rather than rank, who had earned her place in the world through service that came with prices these young women could never imagine paying. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar armor of invisibility that had protected her for 8 years. Rosa straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the cart, and continued down the hallway toward her next assignment, carrying secrets that would have shattered the comfortable assumptions of everyone who dismissed her as just another insignificant part of the institutional machinery. The clock on the wall read 11:47 a.m. as Rosa made her way toward the main conference room, where the day's most important meeting would soon begin. She had no way of knowing that within the next few hours, The careful invisibility she had cultivated for 8 years would be stripped away, revealing truths that would force everyone around her to confront the dangerous assumption that service and sacrifice were always visible, always recognized, always honored by those who benefited from them most. The conference room on the 4th floor buzzed with pre-meeting energy as officers and civilian personnel filed in for the quarterly budget review. Sunlight streamed through floor to ceiling. Windows, illuminating a polished mahogany table, surrounded by leather chairs that had witnessed countless strategic discussions over the years. The walls displayed framed photographs of military operations and distinguished visitors, creating an atmosphere of institutional gravitas that impressed newcomers and intimidated those seeking approval for funding requests. Rosa pushed her cleaning cart quietly along the periphery of the room, methodically emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces while the meeting participants settled into their seats. Her presence was so routine that most people barely registered her existence, treating her like a piece of moving furniture that would eventually disappear on its own. The conversations continued around her as if she possessed neither ears to hear nor understanding to comprehend the sensitive discussions taking place. Lieutenant Colonel Webb entered with his characteristic air of authority, carrying a thick folder of budget documents and wearing the expression of someone prepared to make difficult decisions about resource allocation. He took his position at the head of the table, glancing briefly at his watch before surveying the assembled group with the satisfaction of a commander reviewing his troops. His gaze swept past Rosa without pause, dismissing her presence as thoroughly as he might ignore a potted plant or wall decoration. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of people. "Today we're discussing budget allocations for the next fiscal year, with particular attention to personnel costs and operational efficiency. Some hard choices need to be made, and I expect everyone to approach this discussion with appropriate fiscal responsibility." Major Janet Holloway, the base's chief financial officer, opened her laptop and began projecting spreadsheets onto the large screen at the front of the room. The numbers told a story of competing priorities and limited resources, each line item representing programs, positions, and people whose futures hung in the balance of bureaucratic decision-making. Her presentation was methodical and professional, delivered with the detached precision of someone who had learned to view human resources as statistical variables, rather than individual lives. Support staff costs have increased by 12% over the past 3 years, Holloway explained, her laser pointer highlighting specific budget categories. This includes custodial services, food service, maintenance personnel, and security contractors. We need to examine whether these increases are justified, or if we can achieve the same level of service with fewer personnel. Rosa continued her work, spraying and wiping down the wooden credenza that ran along the far wall. Her movements were silent and efficient, honed by years of practice in remaining unobtrusive during sensitive discussions. But her posture had subtly shifted, her shoulders squaring almost imperceptibly as she listened to people discuss reducing positions that represented livelihoods for dozens of families who depended on base employment. Captain Daniel Morrison, a logistics officer in his early 30s, raised his hand to contribute to the discussion. He was new to Fort Braxton, having transferred from a posting in Germany where he had managed supply chains for NATO operations. His uniform was pristine, his manner eager, and his perspective shaped by business school theories about operational efficiency that looked impressive on PowerPoint slides, but had never been tested in the messy reality of organizational life. "Sir, if I may," Morrison interjected, consulting his own tablet, "I've been reviewing the custodial service contracts, and there are significant opportunities for cost reduction. Many of these positions could be consolidated or eliminated entirely through improved scheduling and productivity metrics." Webb nodded approvingly, pleased to see a subordinate thinking along the same lines as his own budget priorities. Elaborate on that, Captain. What specific recommendations do you have? Morrison stood, moving to the front of the room with the confidence of someone presenting a solution to a problem others had failed to recognize. His briefing folder was organized with military precision, each page marked with colored tabs that corresponded to different categories of proposed cuts. Rosa's cleaning cloth moved steadily across the credenza's surface, but her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly as she listened to the young officer outline his plans. Based on industry standards and productivity analysis, Morrison began, we're currently overstaffed in custodial services by approximately 30%. Many of these workers are approaching retirement age, which creates additional cost burdens. Through increased healthcare utilization and reduced physical capacity, a strategic reduction in force, combined with modernized equipment and revised scheduling, could maintain service levels while significantly reducing operational costs. The room murmured with interest as Morrison outlined his proposal. Charts and graphs appeared on the projection screen, showing potential savings that looked impressive when reduced to colorful bar charts and pie graphs. Rosa's name appeared on one of the spreadsheets, listed among dozens of other employees whose positions had been marked for potential elimination. Her employee number, years of service, and estimated cost savings from her termination were displayed in clinical detail for the room to examine. Take this employee, for example, Morrison said, using his laser pointer to highlight Rosa's information. On the screen, Martinez Rosa, 8 years of service, 62 years old, minimal educational credentials. Her position could be eliminated entirely by redistributing her responsibilities among remaining staff members. The annual savings would be approximately $42,000 when you factor in salary, benefits, and administrative overhead. Rosa's hand stilled for just a moment on the surface she was cleaning, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the cloth. Everyone in the room was looking at the screen, studying her employment record as if she were a line item to be adjusted rather than a person whose livelihood hung in the balance of their decision. The numbers told a story stripped of context, reducing 8 years of reliable service to a simple cost-benefit analysis that ignored everything that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheet cells. Webb leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully as he considered Morrison's presentation. These are exactly the kinds of efficiency improvements we need to be considering, he said approvingly. Too often, we let sentiment override sound business judgment. Military operations require hard choices, and that includes how we manage our support infrastructure. Major Richardson, who had been silent during most of the presentation, finally spoke up from her position near the windows. Her experience in security operations had taught her to consider factors that didn't always appear in budget analyses. And something about Morrison's recommendations troubled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Sir, while I appreciate Captain Morrison's thoroughness, Richardson said carefully, I think we should consider the institutional knowledge we lose when we eliminate long-term employees. Some of these people have been here longer than most of our current officers. They understand the facility's operations in ways that might not be immediately apparent from productivity metrics. Morrison waved dismissively, his confidence unshaken by Richardson's concerns. With respect, Major, institutional knowledge is often just another term for resistance to change. Modern management practices emphasize documented procedures and standardized processes that don't depend on individual employees. We can't let nostalgia interfere with operational efficiency. The discussion continued, with various officers weighing in on different aspects of the proposed budget cuts. Rosa moved to the far corner of the room, organizing her cleaning supplies while listening to people debate her professional worth as if she were absent from the conversation entirely. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, mixing with the low murmur of voices discussing spreadsheet projections and cost-saving initiatives that would reshape dozens of lives based on mathematical calculations rather than human considerations. Dr. Angela Foster, the base's civilian personnel director, finally introduced a note of caution into the discussion. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and the thoughtful demeanor of someone who had spent years mediating between military efficiency and human resources regulations. Her experience had taught her that cost-cutting measures often produced unintended consequences that weren't visible until after the damage had been done. "Colonel Webb," Foster said, consulting her own files, "before we make any final decisions about personnel reductions, I'd recommend reviewing individual employment records more carefully. Some of these long-term employees may have qualifications or backgrounds that aren't immediately apparent from basic personnel files. We want to avoid eliminating valuable human resources based solely on surface-level analysis." Webb glanced at his watch, clearly growing impatient with what he perceived as bureaucratic hand-wringing. "Dr. Foster, I appreciate your concern for employee welfare, but we're operating under a congressional mandate to reduce operational costs by 15%. That requires making decisions based on objective criteria rather than subjective evaluations of employee sentiment." Morrison nodded enthusiastically, encouraged by Webb's support for his recommendations. "Exactly, sir. Military leadership requires the courage to make unpopular decisions when they serve the greater good. Sentiment can't override strategic necessity." Rosa finished her cleaning routine and began pushing her cart toward the exit, her movements as quiet and unobtrusive as they had been throughout the meeting. But as she reached the doorway, Colonel Webb's voice stopped her with a casual comment that carried the weight of institutional indifference. "Before you go," Webb called out, not bothering to look directly at her, "make sure you clean the coffee station thoroughly. We have VIP visitors coming tomorrow, and I want everything spotless. Try not to break anything." The room chuckled at Webb's casual dismissal, treating his comment as the kind of harmless humor that superiors were expected to display toward subordinates. Rosa paused in the doorway, her back straight despite the weight of 8 years' worth of similar comments. For just a moment, something flickered in her dark eyes, not hurt, exactly, but the shadow of a woman who had once been addressed with considerably more respect by people whose lives had depended on her competence. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, her voice carrying none of the emotion that churned beneath the surface. She had learned long ago that responding to disrespect with dignity was often the most powerful form of resistance available to people in her position. As Rosa left the conference room, the discussion resumed with renewed focus on budget projections and efficiency metrics. The officers and civilian personnel continued their debate about resource allocation, completely unaware that they had just dismissed someone whose service record, if they had bothered to examine it carefully, would have revealed experiences that dwarfed anything in their own professional backgrounds. The afternoon stretched ahead with its familiar rhythm of cleaning routines and casual dismissals, but something had shifted in the careful balance Rosa had maintained for 8 years. The conversation in the conference room had stripped away the comfortable fiction that her contributions were valued, even in the limited capacity of custodial work. She was, as Morrison had so clinically demonstrated, nothing more than a line item to be optimized or eliminated based on cost-benefit, calculations that reduced her existence to spreadsheet variables. Walking down the corridor toward her next assignment, Rosa passed a series of framed photographs displaying the base's history and distinguished visitors. One image showed a group of senior officers receiving medals for valor, their faces shining with the pride of recognition for service, above and beyond normal expectations. Another displayed a ceremony honoring fallen soldiers, with flags and wreaths marking the sacrifice of those who had given everything in service to their country. Rosa paused briefly before a photograph showing a military hospital in Afghanistan, where medics and support staff worked to save lives under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The image was credited to an embedded journalist who had documented the daily heroism of people whose names would never appear in history books. but whose actions had shaped the outcome of conflicts that determined the fate of nations. For just a moment, Rosa's carefully maintained composure wavered, her eyes reflecting memories that belonged to a different time and place, where her presence had meant the difference between life and death for people who had learned to trust her judgment without question. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of professional neutrality that had protected her for 8 years of invisibility. The base's public address system crackled to life, announcing the end of the afternoon shift and reminding personnel about upcoming training schedules and security briefings. Rosa checked her watch and realized her workday was nearly finished. Another 8 hours of invisible service that would be forgotten before the building's lights were turned off for the evening. Tomorrow would bring another round of meetings, where her future might be decided by people who had never bothered to learn her name, let alone understand the experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of serving with quiet excellence under any circumstances. But tonight, she would return to her small apartment and the memories that no budget analysis could quantify or eliminate, carrying secrets that would have humbled everyone who had dismissed her as just another expendable support worker whose value could be measured in annual salary costs and productivity metrics. Thursday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that sent fog rolling across Fort Braxton's parade grounds, creating ghostly silhouettes of flagpoles and monuments in the pre-dawn darkness. Rosa Martinez clocked in at her usual time, 5:30 a.m., when the base was still quiet except for the security patrols and early shift personnel who kept the facility operational around the clock. Her thermos of black coffee steamed in the cold air as she walked across the parking lot, gravel crunching beneath her worn work boots. The overnight cleaning crew was finishing their shift as Rosa entered the administrative building, their tired faces reflecting the exhaustion of people who worked while others slept. Maria Santos, a younger woman who had been hired 6 months earlier, greeted Rosa with a weary smile as she pushed her cart toward the exit. Maria was struggling to support 3 children on a custodian's salary, and the rumors about budget cuts had left her visibly anxious about her job security. "Mrs. Martinez," Maria whispered in Spanish, glancing nervously around the empty hallway, "is it true what they're saying about layoffs? My supervisor mentioned something about efficiency reviews and position eliminations. I can't afford to lose this job." Rosa studied the younger woman's face, seeing her own fears reflected in Maria's worried eyes. The conversation from yesterday's budget meeting echoed in her mind, Captain Morrison's clinical analysis of which employees could be eliminated to achieve maximum cost savings. She wanted to offer reassurance, but 8 years of institutional experience had taught her that honesty was often kinder than false hope. "Focus on your work," Rosa advised quietly, her voice carrying the steady calm that had become her trademark over the years. "Do your job well, document everything, and don't give them reasons to criticize your performance. That's all any of us can control." Maria nodded gratefully, drawing strength from Rosa's composed demeanor, even as both women understood the precarious nature of their positions. The younger woman gathered her supplies and headed toward the exit, leaving Rosa alone in the fluorescent-lit hallway with the familiar weight of another person's worried trust settling on her shoulders. The morning routine began with its predictable rhythm, but something felt different in the building's atmosphere. Conversations seemed more hushed, glances more calculating, as if everyone was evaluating their colleagues through the lens of budget optimization rather than personal relationships. Rosa moved through her assigned areas with heightened awareness, noting the subtle changes in behavior that indicated institutional stress filtering down through the ranks. In the second-floor break room, she encountered a group of civilian contractors, discussing the previous day's budget meeting with the animated energy of people who had survived a potential crisis. Their conversation was loud enough to carry across the small space, filled with the relief of those who believed their positions were secure, and the casual cruelty of people discussing others' misfortunes as entertainment. James Fletcher, a facilities management coordinator in his 40s, dominated the conversation with the authority of someone who had cultivated relationships with decision-makers. His expensive suit and confident manner marked him as someone who understood how to navigate bureaucratic politics, and his comments carried the weight of insider knowledge that others lacked. "I heard they're targeting the dead weight in custodial services," Fletcher announced, stirring sugar into his coffee with theatrical emphasis. "About time, if you ask me. Some of these people have been coasting for years, collecting paychecks without contributing anything meaningful to operational efficiency." Sarah Kim, a budget analyst who had attended yesterday's meeting, nodded in agreement while scrolling through her smartphone. Captain Morrison's presentation was impressive. He really did his homework on identifying redundancies and inefficiencies. The savings projections were substantial. Rosa entered the break room quietly, beginning her routine of emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces while the conversation continued around her. The group's voices grew slightly louder, as if her presence had triggered a desire to demonstrate their superiority through casual dismissal of people they considered beneath their notice. "The problem with some of these older workers," Fletcher continued, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate volume, "is that they're stuck in outdated methods and resistant to modernization. They take twice as long to complete basic tasks and require constant supervision to maintain quality standards." Rosa's movements remained steady as she cleaned the coffee station, but her grip on the cleaning cloth had tightened imperceptibly. The casual cruelty in Fletcher's voice was nothing new, but something about his tone suggested a calculated effort to provoke a reaction that could be used to justify the elimination of her position. Kim looked up from her phone, glancing briefly at Rosa before returning her attention to Fletcher's commentary. "I suppose there's something to be said for institutional knowledge, but you can't let sentiment override business decisions. Modern facilities management is about data-driven optimization, not nostalgic attachment to inefficient practices." The conversation shifted to other topics, but Rosa had heard enough to understand the narrative being constructed around her potential termination. She was being characterized as outdated, inefficient, and resistant to change, descriptions that would justify her elimination while protecting the decision-makers from accusations of callousness or discrimination. As Rosa left the break room, she passed Lieutenant Colonel Webb's office, where a different kind of discussion was taking place behind closed doors. Through the glass partition, she could see Webb gesturing emphatically while Captain Morrison nodded attentively. Their conversation clearly focused on implementation of the budget, recommendations that had been presented the previous day. Dr. Foster sat across from them, her expression troubled as she reviewed a stack of personnel files. Even from a distance, Rosa could see the tension in the personnel director's posture, suggesting disagreement with the course of action being discussed. Foster's experience with human resources had taught her to look beyond surface-level evaluations, and something about the proposed cuts clearly troubled her professional judgment. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that would alter the trajectory of Rosa's increasingly precarious situation. Major General Patricia Hayes arrived for an unscheduled inspection of the facility, accompanied by a small team of senior officers who specialized in operational efficiency and security protocols. Her presence sent ripples of anxiety throughout the administrative complex, as unannounced visits from general officers typically indicated serious concerns about facility operations. General Hayes was a compact woman in her mid-50s who had earned her stars through a combination of strategic brilliance and operational excellence. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing confident, and her reputation for thoroughness had made her both respected and feared throughout the command structure. Her inspection team included specialists in personnel management, security operations, and facilities oversight, precisely the kind of expertise that could expose weaknesses in current operations. Rosa was cleaning the main corridor when the inspection team arrived, their footsteps echoing with military precision as they moved through the building. She pressed herself against the wall to allow them passage, her eyes briefly meeting General Hayes' steady gaze before looking away with practiced deference. But something in that momentary contact lingered, a flicker of recognition that neither woman acknowledged, but both seemed to file away for future consideration. Lieutenant Colonel Webb emerged from his office with barely concealed panic, his usual confidence replaced by the nervous energy of someone whose competence was about to be evaluated by superiors who possessed the authority to end careers with a single negative report. He fell into step beside General Hayes, launching into a prepared briefing about operational efficiency improvements and cost-saving initiatives that demonstrated his commitment to fiscal responsibility. "General Hayes," Webb began, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone trying too hard to impress, "I think you'll be pleased with the progress we've made in streamlining operations and eliminating redundancies. We've identified significant opportunities for cost reduction while maintaining service quality." General Hayes listened without comment, her sharp eyes taking in details that escaped Webb's notice. She observed the facility's operations with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate organizations based on subtle indicators rather than prepared presentations. Her questions were precise and probing, designed to reveal the actual state of operations rather than the sanitized version that officials preferred to present. The inspection team spent several hours examining different aspects of the facility's operations, their presence creating an atmosphere of heightened tension throughout the building. Personnel who had been casual about their duties suddenly demonstrated remarkable attention to detail, while conversations became more formal and guarded under the scrutiny of senior leadership. Rosa continued her work with the same methodical precision she brought to every task, but she was acutely aware of the inspection team's presence and the potential implications for her future employment. The timing of General Hayes' visit, coming so soon after yesterday's budget discussions, suggested that higher authorities were taking a close look at proposed changes before they could be implemented. During the afternoon, Rosa overheard fragments of conversations between inspection team members that suggested their evaluation was more comprehensive than Webb had anticipated. They were examining not just cost-saving measures, but also the potential impact of proposed changes on operational effectiveness and institutional knowledge retention, precisely the concerns that Dr. Foster had raised during the budget meeting. Captain Morrison, who had been so confident about his efficiency recommendations, now appeared visibly nervous as he fielded detailed questions from the inspection team about his analysis methodology and implementation timeline. His PowerPoint presentations seemed less impressive when subjected to scrutiny from officers who had decades of experience evaluating organizational effectiveness in high-stakes environments. As the day progressed, Rosa noticed subtle changes in the behavior of personnel who had been most vocal about eliminating her position. Fletcher's confident dismissal of older workers became more muted when senior officers were within earshot, while Kim's enthusiasm for data-driven optimization was tempered by awareness that her own analysis methods might be subject to professional review. The inspection concluded with a closed-door meeting between General Hayes and the facility's senior leadership, their discussion lasting well into the evening hours. Rosa finished her assigned duties and prepared to leave for the day, unaware that her name had been mentioned multiple times during conversations that would ultimately determine her fate and the fate of several other long-term employees whose true value had been overlooked by cost-cutting zealots. As she walked across the parking lot toward her aging sedan, Rosa reflected on the day's events with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had learned to navigate institutional uncertainty with dignity and tact. She had survived 8 years of casual dismissal and bureaucratic indifference, adapting to changes that would have broken people with less resilience and fewer survival skills. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and potentially life-altering decisions, But tonight she would return to her modest apartment and the private world, where her true identity could exist without institutional constraints. The secrets she carried would remain hidden for now, but the careful balance she had maintained between visibility and invisibility was beginning to shift in ways that would soon force everyone around her to confront their assumptions about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of honor. Friday morning descended on Fort Braxton with an electric tension that seemed to crackle through the administrative complex like static before a thunderstorm. Word had spread overnight that General Hayes' inspection had uncovered significant concerns about proposed operational changes, and the usual Friday morning casualness was replaced by an atmosphere of heightened alertness. Personnel who had spent Thursday evening celebrating anticipated budget approvals now found themselves questioning the security of decisions they had assumed were final. Rosa arrived at her usual time to find the building already buzzing with unusual activity. Security personnel were conducting additional sweeps of classified areas, while senior officers moved through the corridors with the purposeful stride of people, responding to urgent directives from higher command. The overnight cleaning crew reported that lights had remained on in several offices well past midnight, suggesting that Thursday's inspection had triggered emergency reviews of policies and procedures. Dr. Foster emerged from her office carrying a thick stack of personnel files, her expression grim as she headed toward the elevator. Rosa caught a glimpse of her own name on one of the folder tabs, along with dozens of other long-term employees whose records were apparently being subjected to more detailed scrutiny than the superficial reviews that had characterized Morrison's cost-cutting analysis. The personnel director's usual composed demeanor had been replaced by the focused intensity of someone working under significant pressure. In the main lobby, Rosa encountered Sergeant First Class Antonio Rodriguez, one of the few active-duty military personnel who had ever acknowledged her presence with genuine respect rather than polite indifference. Rodriguez was in his late 30s, a career soldier who had served multiple combat deployments and possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to evaluate people based on character rather than rank or position. "Morning, Mrs. Martinez." Rodriguez greeted her with a slight nod, his tone carrying the courtesy he extended to all base personnel, regardless of their position in the institutional hierarchy. "Looks like it's going to be an interesting day around here. Word is that yesterday's inspection raised some eyebrows at division level." Rosa paused in her equipment check, studying Rodriguez's expression for clues about developments that might affect her precarious employment situation. Over the years, she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when institutional changes were brewing, and Rodriguez's careful choice of words suggested that General Hayes' visit had consequences extending far beyond routine operational review. "Changes coming?" Rosa asked quietly, her voice carrying the neutral tone she had perfected for navigating conversations that might venture into sensitive territory. Rodriguez glanced around the lobby before responding, ensuring their conversation wouldn't be overheard by personnel who might misinterpret his comments as criticism of command decisions. "Let's just say that some of the efficiency recommendations from earlier this week are getting a second look from people who understand the difference between cutting costs and cutting corners." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morrison, who emerged from the elevator looking considerably less confident than he had during Tuesday's budget presentation. His uniform was still immaculate, but his posture suggested someone who had spent a sleepless night defending analysis that had seemed unassailable just days earlier. He nodded curtly to Rodriguez while completely ignoring Rosa's presence, his behavior reflecting the kind of institutional blindness that had characterized his approach to personnel management. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Morrison said, his voice carrying forced authority, "I need you to review the security protocols for support staff access to classified areas. There may be some changes coming to personnel assignments that will require updated clearance procedures." Rodriguez straightened to attention, But Rosa caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested professional skepticism about Morrison's sudden interest in security protocols. "Sir, are we talking about new hires or modifications to existing personnel clearances?" Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with questions that required him to reveal information he might not be authorized to discuss. "Just review the current procedures and prepare recommendations for any necessary updates. I'll provide specific guidance once certain decisions have been finalized." As Morrison walked away, Rodriguez shook his head slightly, his expression reflecting the frustration of experienced personnel who had learned to recognize bureaucratic uncertainty disguised as authoritative direction. He turned back to Rosa with an apologetic shrug, acknowledging the awkwardness of the exchange without directly criticizing a superior officer. "Like I said," Rodriguez murmured, "interesting day ahead." The morning progressed with an undercurrent of institutional anxiety that affected everyone from senior officers to civilian contractors. Conversations were more guarded, decisions were deferred pending additional review, and the usual Friday morning relaxation was replaced by the kind of nervous energy that accompanied major organizational changes. Rosa moved through her assigned areas with heightened awareness, noting the subtle behavioral shifts that indicated systemic stress filtering through the command structure. In the executive conference room, an emergency meeting was taking place between General Hayes' inspection team and Fort Braxton's senior leadership. Through the glass walls, Rosa could see animated discussions involving charts, documents, and the kind of gesturing that suggested fundamental disagreements about policy implementation. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's usually confident demeanor had been replaced by the defensive posture of someone whose judgment was being questioned by superiors whose opinions could determine his career trajectory. Major Richardson sat at one end of the conference table, her security files spread before her as she responded to questions from the inspection team. Her expression suggested professional concern about issues that extended beyond routine operational review, and her frequent references to classified documents indicated that the discussion involved sensitive information not typically shared. In standard budget meetings, Dr. Foster occupied a central position at the table, her personnel files organized in neat stacks that corresponded to different categories of employees under review. Rosa noticed that one stack was considerably thicker than the others, containing records for long-term support staff whose backgrounds apparently warranted more detailed examination than Morrison's superficial analysis had provided. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with participants occasionally stepping out to make phone calls or retrieve additional documents from their offices. The prolonged discussion suggested that General Hayes' inspection had uncovered complexities that required careful consideration, rather than the quick decisions that characterized routine administrative changes. During her lunch break, Rosa encountered Maria Santos in the employee parking lot, where the younger woman was sitting in her car with tears streaming down her face. The morning's institutional tension had intensified rumors about impending layoffs, and Maria's anxiety about supporting her children had reached the breaking point. She looked up as Rosa approached, her expression a mixture of desperation and hope that someone might provide reassurance about an uncertain future. "Mrs. Martinez," Maria whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, "my supervisor said there might be an announcement this afternoon about position eliminations. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I don't know what I'll do if they let me go. My kids need health care, and there aren't any other jobs that pay enough to support us." Rosa studied the younger woman's face, seeing her own fears reflected in Maria's worried eyes. The institutional machinery that was evaluating their worth, based on spreadsheet calculations, had no mechanism for considering the human cost of efficiency improvements, reducing their lives to statistical variables that could be adjusted without regard for the consequences. "Whatever happens," Rosa said quietly, placing a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder, "you're stronger than you know." Sometimes the worst situations force us to discover capabilities we didn't realize we possessed. Focus on taking care of your children, and let the rest unfold as it will. Maria nodded gratefully, drawing strength from Rosa's calm presence, even as both women understood that encouragement couldn't change the institutional forces that were reshaping their professional lives. The afternoon would bring decisions that had been set in motion by people who viewed them as expendable resources rather than human beings with families, dreams, and contributions that couldn't be quantified in budget analyses. As Rosa returned to the building, she passed a group of civilian contractors discussing the morning's developments with the animated excitement of people who believed they were immune to the changes affecting others. Their conversation revealed fragments of information about the emergency meeting, including references to personnel security concerns and background verification discrepancies that suggested the inspection had uncovered issues extending beyond simple cost-cutting measures. James Fletcher was holding court near the main entrance, his voice carrying the authority of someone who cultivated connections with decision-makers and used inside information to maintain his position in the informal hierarchy of institutional influence. His comments were loud enough to be overheard by anyone passing through the area, creating an atmosphere of calculated intimidation directed at personnel whose positions were under review. "From what I understand," Fletcher announced to his audience of administrative staff, the inspection team found serious gaps in personnel screening procedures for support staff. Apparently, some of these long-term employees have been working here for years without proper background verification. It's exactly the kind of security vulnerability that modern facilities management is designed to prevent. Sarah Kim nodded in agreement, consulting her smartphone for additional details about the morning's developments. Captain Morrison mentioned that updated security protocols might require eliminating positions that can't meet enhanced clearance requirements. It's really a matter of institutional integrity rather than simple cost reduction. Rosa passed through their conversation without acknowledging the pointed references to her situation, but something in Fletcher's tone suggested that he possessed information about the inspection results that hadn't been shared with general personnel. His confidence about security concerns and clearance requirements indicated that the afternoon's announcements might involve issues more complex than routine budget adjustments. The day's final hours approached with mounting institutional tension that affected everyone from senior officers to support staff. Rosa completed her assigned duties with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work for 8 years, but she was acutely aware that this might be among her last days in a position that had provided both financial security and protective anonymity. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the administrative complex, word spread that General Hayes would be conducting a final briefing before departing Fort Braxton. The announcement suggested that her inspection had reached conclusions significant enough to warrant direct communication with facility personnel, rather than the routine reports that typically followed standard operational reviews. Rosa finished cleaning the main corridor and began organizing her equipment for the end of her shift, unaware that the next few hours would strip away the careful invisibility she had maintained for 8 years and force everyone around her to confront assumptions about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of institutional value. The auditorium remained frozen in absolute silence as General Hayes advanced to the next slide, which displayed a close-up photograph of military insignia and unit patches that told a story few civilians would understand, but every career military officer would recognize with awe. The 75th Ranger Regiment tab was clearly visible, along with specialized qualification badges that indicated completion of training programs reserved for America's most elite warriors. The soldier whose record we're examining, General Hayes announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, served with the 75th Ranger Regiment during some of the most challenging operations of the past 3 decades. She completed Ranger School, advanced individual training in multiple military occupational specialties, and specialized courses that prepared her for missions requiring the highest levels of physical courage and tactical expertise. A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled personnel as the significance of the Ranger designation became clear. Even civilians familiar with military culture understood that Rangers represented the pinnacle of military excellence, soldiers who had proven themselves capable of operations that others couldn't survive. The woman they had dismissed as an aging custodian had once belonged to an elite brotherhood that fewer than 1% of military personnel ever joined. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's face had drained of all color, his earlier confidence replaced by the horrified realization that his cost-cutting recommendations had targeted someone whose military credentials far exceeded his own administrative service record. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as he stared at the screen, mentally calculating the magnitude of the professional disaster he had narrowly avoided through General Hayes' intervention. Captain Morrison had gone completely rigid in his seat, his expensive business school theories about personnel optimization crumbling under the weight of evidence that his analysis had been catastrophically inadequate. The efficiency metrics that had seemed so sophisticated now appeared as the amateur calculations of someone who had confused surface appearances with genuine assessment of human capabilities. Major Richardson activated the next slide, which displayed a partial list of Rosa's military decorations and commendations. Even with sensitive details redacted for security purposes, the visible awards painted a picture of extraordinary service under conditions that had tested the limits of human endurance. Bronze stars, Purple Hearts, and unit citations told a story of repeated exposure to mortal danger in service of missions that had shaped the outcome of conflicts most Americans knew nothing about. During her 8 years of service, General Hayes continued, this individual participated in operations that remain classified at the highest levels of national security. Her unit was deployed to regions where American interests required the kind of decisive action that could only be accomplished by soldiers whose training, courage, and competence had been proven under the most extreme circumstances. Rosa sat motionless in her seat near the back of the auditorium, her weathered hands folded in her lap as her most closely guarded secrets were shared with hundreds of people who had never bothered to look beyond her humble exterior. The careful invisibility that had protected her for 8 years was being systematically dismantled, exposing vulnerabilities she had spent nearly a decade learning to conceal. Dr. Foster stepped forward, consulting the classified folder she had been carrying. Throughout the afternoon, her expression reflected professional vindication, mixed with genuine admiration for someone whose true qualifications had finally been properly documented and recognized by appropriate authority. The personnel file we're reviewing, Foster announced, contains commendations from commanding officers who described this individual's performance as exemplary under conditions that would have broken personnel with less dedication and competence. Her medical records document injuries sustained in combat operations, followed by rehabilitation and return to active duty despite offers of medical discharge that would have ended her service with full honors. The projection screen displayed a map showing deployment locations across multiple continents, with redacted mission dates and operational designations that hinted at the scope of Rosa's service without revealing details that remained classified for national security reasons. The geographic spread told a story of someone who had served wherever American interests required the presence of elite soldiers, capable of operating independently in hostile environments. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had always treated Rosa with respect, despite her humble position, now stared at the screen with the growing awareness that his instincts about her character had been more accurate than he had realized. His experience in combat operations had taught him to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished genuine warriors from those who had never faced mortal danger, and Rosa's quiet dignity had always suggested depths that others had failed to perceive. The individual we're discussing, General Hayes continued, left active duty after completing her full term of enlistment with a service record that would qualify her for positions requiring the highest levels of security clearance and operational responsibility. She chose civilian employment not because she lacked other opportunities, but because she preferred to continue serving in a capacity that allowed her to maintain the privacy she had earned through years of sacrifice. James Fletcher, who had spent the week mocking older support staff as dead weight, now sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of his misjudgment became apparent. His casual dismissal of Rosa's capabilities revealed itself as the ignorant prejudice of someone who had confused external appearances with actual competence, demonstrating the kind of institutional blindness that could have cost the facility one of its most qualified personnel. The auditorium's atmosphere had shifted from routine administrative briefing to something approaching a military ceremony, as personnel began to understand that they were witnessing the recognition of service that deserved honor rather than elimination. The bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized the week's budget discussions seemed petty and misguided when measured against the reality of Rosa's distinguished military background. General Hayes gestured toward the back of the auditorium, her gaze settling on Rosa with the kind of recognition that passed between veterans who had served in circumstances others couldn't imagine. "Sergeant First Class Rosa Martinez, please come forward." The request fell on the assembled personnel like a physical force, creating a ripple of movement as heads turned to locate the person whose true identity had been concealed among them for 8 years. Rosa remained seated for a moment, her composure intact despite the emotional weight of public recognition she had never sought and had actively avoided since leaving military service. Slowly, Rosa rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the tremor in her hands that spoke of age rather than fear. She walked down the center aisle with the measured pace of someone who had learned to project calm under any circumstances, her eyes focused straight ahead rather than acknowledging the hundreds of faces that watched her passage with expressions ranging from amazement to shame. As Rosa approached the front of the auditorium, General Hayes stepped away from the podium, her posture shifting to the formal attention that preceded military ceremonies of recognition and honor. The projection screen behind them displayed the Ranger Regiment insignia, its eagle and scroll design representing standards of excellence that few soldiers ever achieved and fewer still maintained throughout their service careers. "Sergeant Martinez," General Hayes announced, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium, "your service record represents the highest traditions of military excellence and personal sacrifice. Your continued dedication to serving others, even in civilian capacity, reflects the values that define America's finest soldiers." Rosa stopped before the general, her back straight despite the weight of years and the emotional burden of public recognition. For 8 years, she had successfully maintained anonymity that allowed her to serve without the complications that accompanied her military reputation. Now, standing before hundreds of people who had dismissed her as insignificant, she faced the challenge of accepting honor she had never wanted, while maintaining the dignity that had characterized her response to years of casual disrespect. "Ma'am," Rosa replied quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I was just doing my job then and now." General Hayes smiled slightly, recognizing the characteristic humility of elite soldiers who measured their worth by standards that made external recognition seem unnecessary. "Sergeant Martinez, your job included operations that saved American lives and advanced national security interests in ways that most citizens will never understand or appreciate. Your current position represents continued service that deserves recognition rather than elimination." The auditorium remained absolutely silent as General Hayes reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a small object that gleamed gold in the overhead lighting. Rosa recognized it immediately as a challenge coin, the kind of token that senior officers presented to personnel whose service had earned special recognition beyond routine commendations and awards. "This coin," General Hayes announced, Bears. The insignia of the Rangers who served with distinction in operations that tested the limits of human courage and competence. It represents a brotherhood of warriors who proved themselves worthy of trust when the stakes were life and death for their fellow soldiers and the success of missions that shaped history. Rosa accepted the coin with hands that no longer trembled, her weathered fingers closing around the metal token that connected her to memories of service she had tried to leave behind. The weight of the coin seemed disproportionate to its size, carrying the accumulated burden of recognition she had avoided for 8 years. By choosing invisibility over acknowledgement, Lieutenant Colonel Webb sat paralyzed in his seat, finally understanding that his casual dismissal of support staff had nearly resulted in the elimination of someone whose qualifications made his own administrative achievements appear insignificant by comparison. The budget optimization that had seemed so impressive earlier in the week now looked like institutional blindness that could have cost Fort Braxton one of its most valuable human resources. Captain Morrison stared at Rosa with the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about personnel evaluation had been shattered by evidence of his own incompetence. His efficiency analysis had reduced a decorated war veteran to a statistical variable, demonstrating the kind of bureaucratic arrogance that confused quantitative metrics with genuine assessment of human worth and capability. Around the auditorium, personnel who had spent years treating Rosa as invisible furniture now faced the uncomfortable reality that their casual indifference had been directed toward someone whose service record commanded respect from the highest levels of military authority. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed them to dismiss her contributions were crumbling under the weight of evidence that challenged everything they thought they understood about recognizing and valuing true excellence. The challenge coin felt warm in Rosa's palm as she stood before the assembled personnel, its weight carrying memories of comrades who had earned similar recognition through sacrifice that few would ever understand. General Hayes maintained her formal military bearing, but something in her expression had softened as she recognized the quiet dignity with which Rosa accepted honor she had never sought and had actively avoided for 8 years. Sergeant Martinez, General Hayes continued, her voice now carrying a personal warmth that transcended official protocol. Your service represents the finest traditions of American military excellence. More importantly, your continued dedication to serving others demonstrates that true leadership isn't defined by rank or recognition, but by character that persists regardless of external circumstances. The auditorium remained absolutely silent as Rosa looked down at the coin in her weathered hands, its golden surface reflecting the overhead lights like captured sunlight. Around the edges, she could make out the intricate details of the Ranger insignia that had once adorned her own uniform, symbols that connected her to a brotherhood forged in combat zones, where courage was measured by actions rather than words. "Ma'am," Rosa replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I appreciate the recognition, but I need everyone here to understand something important. Military service isn't about individual glory or personal achievement. It's about being part of something larger than yourself, and that responsibility doesn't end when you take off the uniform." She turned to face the auditorium, her eyes sweeping across hundreds of faces that had regarded her as invisible for 8 years. Her posture had subtly shifted, revealing the bearing of someone who had once commanded respect in situations where hesitation could cost lives. The transformation was almost imperceptible, but everyone present could sense that they were seeing Rosa Martinez as she truly was for the first time. "For 8 years," Rosa continued, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I've worked alongside people who judge others based on appearances, positions, and assumptions about worth that have nothing to do with actual character or capability. I've watched talented individuals be dismissed because they don't fit narrow definitions of what leadership or competence looks like." Lieutenant Colonel Webb sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as he realized that Rosa's words were directed specifically at the institutional blindness that had characterized his approach to personnel management. His budget optimization plans, which had seemed so sophisticated earlier in the week, now looked like the amateur calculations of someone who had confused authority with wisdom. "The young woman who cleans the offices upstairs," Rosa continued, gesturing toward the back of the auditorium where Maria Santos sat with tears streaming down her face, "works 2 jobs to support 3 children after her husband was killed in Afghanistan. She shows up every day despite exhaustion and worry, maintaining standards that exceed anything in your efficiency manuals. But your cost-cutting analysis saw her as expendable because she doesn't have a college degree." Maria covered her mouth with both hands, overwhelmed by Rosa's public recognition of her struggles and dedication. Around her, other support staff members began to understand that Rosa's revelation wasn't just about her own hidden background, but about the institutional failure to recognize value in people who served without seeking acknowledgement or advancement. "Captain." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His expensive business school theories about personnel optimization crumbling under the weight of Rosa's quiet indictment of bureaucratic arrogance. His efficiency recommendations had reduced human beings to statistical variables, demonstrating exactly the kind of institutional blindness that Rosa was describing. "The maintenance supervisor who keeps this facility operational," Rosa continued, her gaze settling on an older man near the middle of the auditorium, "served 3 tours in Iraq before taking a civilian position that pays half what he could earn in the private sector. He stays because he believes in serving something larger than personal profit. Your analysis recommended eliminating his position because his productivity metrics don't account for the institutional knowledge that prevents costly equipment failures." General Hayes watched Rosa's impromptu address with growing admiration, recognizing the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught in staff colleges or learned from management textbooks. Rosa was transforming what could have been a moment of personal triumph into a teaching opportunity that challenged everyone present to examine their assumptions about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of institutional value. Military service teaches you that the most important contributions often come from people who never seek recognition, Rosa said, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "The medic who saves lives under fire, the supply sergeant who ensures ammunition reaches forward positions, the communications specialist who maintains contact when everything else fails. These people understand that real leadership means putting the mission and the welfare of others ahead of personal advancement." Dr. Foster stepped forward from her position near the projection equipment, her personnel files forgotten as she listened to Rosa articulate principles that had guided her own approach to human resources management. For years she had watched talented individuals be overlooked by supervisors who valued superficial credentials over genuine character and competence. "Sergeant Martinez," Foster interjected, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium, "would you consider accepting a position that would allow you to share these insights with our leadership development programs? Your perspective on recognizing and developing human potential could help us avoid the kind of institutional blindness that nearly cost us your continued service." Rosa considered the offer for a moment, her expression thoughtful as she weighed the implications of accepting a role that would make her visible in ways she had spent 8 years avoiding. The challenge coin in her palm seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding her of comrades who had made far greater sacrifices without expectation of recognition or reward. "Dr. Foster," Rosa replied, "I'm honored by the offer, but I think I can serve better by continuing to do what I've always done, working alongside the people who keep this institution functioning while their contributions go unnoticed. Sometimes the most effective leadership happens when nobody realizes they're being led." She turned back to face General Hayes, her posture straightening to the military bearing that had once commanded respect in combat zones around the world. "Ma'am, if you want to honor my service, I ask that you look more carefully at the people who work here every day without seeking advancement or recognition. They're the ones who truly understand what it means to serve." General Hayes nodded slowly, understanding that Rosa's request represented exactly the kind of selfless leadership that had made her an exceptional soldier and would make her an invaluable civilian employee. "Sergeant Martinez, your continued service in any capacity would be an honor for this installation. However, I'm implementing immediate changes to our personnel evaluation procedures to ensure that we never again mistake quiet competence for expendability." The general turned to address Lieutenant Colonel Webb directly, her voice carrying the full weight of command authority. "Colonel Webb, the budget recommendations submitted by your staff demonstrated a fundamental failure to properly assess the qualifications and value of long-term personnel. Effective immediately, all proposed personnel changes will be reviewed by a board that includes senior enlisted personnel and civilian employees who understand the actual requirements of institutional operations." Webb nodded stiffly. His earlier confidence completely evaporated as he realized that his career trajectory had been permanently altered by his casual dismissal of support staff, whose true qualifications exceeded his own administrative achievements. The efficiency metrics that had impressed him in Morrison's presentations now looked like the amateur calculations of someone who had confused quantitative analysis with genuine leadership insight. "Captain Morrison," General Hayes continued, "your analysis will serve as a case study in how not to evaluate human resources. I'm recommending that you attend additional training in personnel management before being considered for any position involving staff oversight or budget responsibility." Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that his ambitious efficiency recommendations had become professional liabilities that would follow him throughout his military career. His business school theories about organizational optimization had been exposed as inadequate substitutes for the kind of practical wisdom that came from actually understanding the people whose lives were affected by bureaucratic decisions. As the formal briefing concluded, personnel began filing out of the auditorium with subdued conversations that reflected the magnitude of the lessons they had witnessed. Many stopped to acknowledge Rosa with respectful nods or quiet words of thanks, their previous indifference replaced by genuine appreciation for someone whose character had been tested under circumstances they could barely imagine. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Rosa as she prepared to leave, his expression reflecting professional respect mixed with personal admiration. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, extending his hand, "it's been an honor serving alongside you, even though I didn't understand how great that honor was until today." Rosa shook his hand firmly, appreciating the genuine respect from someone whose own military experience allowed him to understand the significance of her background. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you treated me with dignity when others couldn't see past my coveralls. That kind of character is rarer and more valuable than any military decoration." Maria Santos waited near the auditorium exit, her eyes red from crying but her posture straight with newfound confidence. Rosa embraced the younger woman gently, understanding that the public recognition of her struggles had transformed her from an anxious employee into someone who finally felt valued by the institution she served. "Mrs. Martinez," Maria whispered, "thank you for seeing me when others didn't. Thank you for standing up for all of us who just wanted to do good work and take care of our families." "Maria," Rosa replied softly, "you don't need my protection or anyone else's validation. You've proven your worth every day for 6 months. Now you just need to believe in yourself the way I've always believed in you." As evening settled over Fort Braxton, Rosa walked across the parking lot toward her aging sedan, the challenge coin secure in her pocket alongside memories of comrades who had earned similar recognition through sacrifices that would never be fully understood by those who benefited from their service. The careful invisibility that had protected her for 8 years was gone, replaced by a different kind of service that honored the past while building a better future. Behind her, lights began coming on in the administrative complex where personnel were already implementing changes that would ensure Rosa's experience would never be repeated. The institutional blindness that had nearly cost Fort Braxton one of its most valuable employees was being replaced by systems that recognized worth based on character and contribution rather than superficial appearances and bureaucratic assumptions. Stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky as Rosa started her car, their distant light reminding her of nights spent in forward positions where the difference between success and catastrophic failure was measured in the courage and competence of individual soldiers who understood that true service required no recognition beyond the knowledge that their sacrifices mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve. But tonight Rosa Martinez drove home with the satisfaction of knowing that her 8 years of quiet dedication had finally been recognized, not just for what it was, but for what it represented. The enduring truth that real leadership comes from those who serve others without expectation of reward, recognition, or anything beyond the privilege of making a difference in a world that depends on such service to survive. 3 months later, Fort Braxton had transformed into a model facility for personnel recognition and institutional excellence. The changes implemented following General Hayes' inspection had rippled throughout the military command structure, with other installations requesting copies of the new evaluation protocols that ensured no qualified individual would be overlooked due to superficial assessments or bureaucratic assumptions. Rosa continued her custodial duties with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work for 8 years. But her interactions with facility personnel had evolved in subtle ways that reflected genuine mutual respect. Officers who had previously ignored her presence now acknowledged her with courteous nods, while civilian contractors sought her advice on matters ranging from facility maintenance to personnel management strategies. The memorial garden that had been established near the main entrance featured a bronze plaque honoring all facility support staff, with special recognition for those whose service extended beyond their current positions. Rosa's name appeared among dozens of others, but she had specifically requested that the inscription emphasize collective service rather than individual achievement, maintaining the humble approach that had defined her character throughout her military and civilian careers. Maria Santos had been promoted to facilities supervisor, her newfound confidence allowing her to implement efficiency improvements that had impressed even the most skeptical administrators. Her success story became part of the orientation program for new employees, demonstrating how institutional support could unlock potential that had been overlooked by previous management approaches. Dr. Foster had established a mentorship program that paired experienced support staff with new employees, ensuring that institutional knowledge would be properly transferred rather than lost through premature personnel eliminations. Rosa served as an informal advisor to the program, her insights helping to identify and develop leadership potential among employees whose contributions had been undervalued by traditional assessment methods. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had been reassigned to a staff position where his administrative skills could be utilized without involving personnel management decisions. His experience at Fort Braxton had become a cautionary tale in military leadership courses, illustrating how institutional blindness could nearly cost organizations their most valuable human resources. Captain Morrison had completed extensive additional training in personnel management and organizational psychology, his reformed approach to efficiency analysis now emphasizing human factors alongside quantitative metrics. His case study presentations at military conferences focused on the dangers of reducing complex human capabilities to simplified statistical models. The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Rosa finished her final rounds of the administrative complex, her thoughts reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought her from elite military service to custodial work to reluctant recognition as a symbol of unacknowledged excellence. The challenge coin remained in her pocket, its presence a daily reminder of comrades who had made ultimate sacrifices without seeking glory or recognition. As she walked toward her car, Rosa noticed a young soldier struggling with heavy equipment. Near the loading dock, his inexperience evident in his inefficient approach to the task. Without hesitation, she set down her cleaning supplies and approached the soldier, with the same quiet authority that had once guided combat operations in hostile territory. "Son," she said gently, "let me show you a better way to handle that. Sometimes the most efficient approach isn't the most obvious one." The soldier looked up gratefully, recognizing in Rosa's weathered features the kind of competence that transcended rank or position. As she demonstrated proper lifting techniques and load distribution, he understood that he was receiving instruction from someone whose knowledge had been earned through experiences far more demanding than routine equipment handling. "Thank you." "Ma'am," the soldier said respectfully, "I'm still learning the procedures here." "We're all still learning," Rosa replied with a slight smile. "The key is being willing to accept help from people who might not look like what you expect teachers to look like." The soldier nodded thoughtfully, filing away both the practical instruction and the deeper lesson about recognizing wisdom regardless of its source. As Rosa gathered her supplies and continued toward her car, he watched her departure with the kind of respect that couldn't be commanded, but could only be earned through character demonstrated consistently over time. The drive home took Rosa through the small town that had grown up around Fort Braxton, its economy dependent on the military installation and the families who had chosen to build their lives in service to something larger than personal ambition. Streetlights illuminated modest homes where military families and civilian employees lived side by side, their shared commitment to national service creating bonds that transcended differences in rank, background, or individual circumstances. Rosa's apartment was Spartan but comfortable, furnished with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned to find contentment in simplicity rather than material accumulation. The walls displayed a few carefully chosen photographs from her military service, images that captured moments of camaraderie and shared purpose rather than individual achievements or formal ceremonies. On her kitchen table sat a stack of letters from former colleagues who had learned of her recognition through military networks, their messages expressing gratitude for service they had witnessed firsthand and admiration for her continued dedication to serving others. She read each letter carefully, appreciating the connections that military service had forged across decades and continents. The final letter in the stack was from General Hayes, who had been promoted to an even more senior position based partly on her insightful handling of the Fort Braxton situation. Her message was brief but heartfelt, expressing continued respect for Rosa's example and requesting permission to share her story with other commanders facing similar challenges in recognizing and utilizing human potential within their organizations. Rosa set the letter aside and prepared her simple dinner, her evening routine unchanged, despite the recognition that had transformed her status within the Fort Braxton community. The quiet satisfaction of work well done remained more meaningful to her than external validation, though she appreciated the institutional changes that would protect other employees from the dismissive treatment she had endured for 8 years. As night settled over the small town, Rosa reflected on the unexpected turns that had brought her from combat zones to custodial closets to reluctant recognition as a symbol of service that transcended conventional definitions of leadership and excellence. The path had been challenging but ultimately rewarding, demonstrating that true fulfillment came from serving others, regardless of whether that service was acknowledged or appreciated by those who benefited from it. The stars became visible through her kitchen window, their distant light carrying memories of nights spent in forward positions where survival depended on the courage and competence of ordinary people who had volunteered for extraordinary challenges. Those experiences had shaped her understanding that real heroism rarely announced itself with fanfare, instead manifesting in the quiet dedication of individuals who chose service over self-interest. excellence over mediocrity, and character over convenience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.